Hi, I'm Zoe. 3 months ago, I walked into what should have been the biggest interview of my life at TechFlow Industries. I'd prepared for weeks, polished my portfolio until it gleamed, and practiced my presentation until I could deliver it in my sleep. The position was perfect: Senior Data Analytics Manager, leading a team of 8 brilliant minds, working on cutting-edge fraud detection algorithms that could revolutionize how banks protect their customers. $145,000 plus equity in a company that was about to explode into the stratosphere. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The interview went flawlessly. The CTO practically glowed when I walked them through my machine learning models. The team lead asked if I could start Monday. I left that glass tower feeling like I was floating on air, already mentally decorating my new office and planning how I'd celebrate with my family that evening. But when I got the call 2 days later, it wasn't the offer I expected. Instead, Diana Worthington from HR delivered words that still echo in my head. After careful consideration and additional reference checks, we've decided to pursue other candidates. We wish you the best in your future endeavors. Additional reference checks. I hadn't listed my parents as references. I hadn't even told them the company name. 6 weeks later, I discovered exactly what those additional reference checks revealed. My own mother had called TechFlow's HR department, introduced herself as my former supervisor, and told them I was emotionally unstable, prone to breakdowns under pressure, and had a history of fabricating achievements to make myself look better. My father had followed up with a second call, claiming to be a family friend who felt morally obligated to warn them about my tendency toward dishonesty and my inability to handle responsibility. They didn't just cost me a job. They systematically destroyed my reputation at the one company I'd dreamed of joining since college. But here's what they didn't know: that rejection letter wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of something they never saw coming. Because 6 weeks ago, Harrison Reed, the CEO of TechFlow Industries, personally called me on a Tuesday morning and said something that made my parents' faces drain of color when they found out. He called me chairman. The morning of November 15th started like any other Tuesday in the Caldwell household, which meant it started with Brooke. My sister had transformed our family's spacious Westlake Hills kitchen into her personal content studio, complete with ring lights positioned at precisely the right angles to catch the morning sun streaming through our floor-to-ceiling windows. The granite countertops, normally pristine, were artfully arranged with props for her latest lifestyle video about morning routines that spark productivity and joy. I stood in the doorway between the kitchen and our living room, holding a mug of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes earlier while Brooke filmed her seventh take of the same 30-second segment about the importance of gratitude journaling. The expensive camera equipment took up most of the breakfast bar, leaving little room for anyone who actually wanted to eat breakfast. Not that anyone seemed to mind. My parents sat at the dining table just beyond the kitchen, scrolling through their phones and occasionally offering suggestions about lighting or angles. This was our normal. Brooke's content creation schedule dictated the family rhythm, and the rest of us moved around her like planets orbiting the sun. She had built an impressive following over the past 2 years, sharing everything from fashion hauls to relationship advice to productivity tips, and somewhere along the way, her success had become the family's pride and primary topic of conversation. I took a sip of my lukewarm coffee and checked my phone for what felt like the 100th time that morning. Still no response from the 3 consulting inquiries I'd sent out the night before. It had been 2 months since the TechFlow rejection, and my savings account was starting to look as empty as my inbox. Freelance data analysis projects were keeping me afloat, but barely, and each passing day made the sting of that lost opportunity feel sharper rather than duller. "Zoe, you're in my shot again," Brooke said without looking up from her camera display. Her voice carried that particular blend of patience and irritation that suggested this wasn't the first time she'd had to address my presence. "Could you maybe grab your coffee and head upstairs? I'm trying to capture authentic morning energy here." I glanced around the kitchen, noting that I was standing a good 10 feet away from her setup, nowhere near what could reasonably be considered her shot. But I also knew that pointing this out would only escalate things, and I didn't have the energy for a confrontation before 9 in the morning. Instead, I moved toward the stairs, planning to retreat to my childhood bedroom and continue my job search in peace. That's when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the area code was local. Austin companies sometimes called from different extensions, so I answered with the professional tone I'd perfected over months of job hunting. "Hello, this is Zoe Caldwell. Miss Caldwell, this is Diana Worthington from TechFlow Industries HR department. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. My heart stopped. TechFlow. After 2 months of silence, they were calling me. Maybe they'd had second thoughts. Maybe the candidate they'd chosen hadn't worked out. Maybe this was my second chance. Not at all, I managed my voice steadier than I felt. How can I help you? There was a pause that lasted just long enough to make me nervous. Miss Caldwell, I'm calling because we've received some additional information regarding your application, and I wanted to give you an opportunity to address it directly. Additional information, the phrase landed in my stomach like a stone. I'm sorry, what kind of additional information? We received calls from 2 individuals who identified themselves as people who had worked with you previously. The information they provided raised some concerns about your professional conduct and reliability. I wanted to hear your side before we made any final determinations. The world tilted sideways. Calls from people who had worked with me. But I'd been unemployed for the past 6 months, focusing entirely on job hunting. The only people I'd worked with recently were classmates from my master's program, and I'd maintained good relationships with all of them. Who could possibly have called TechFlow with negative information about me? I'm not sure I understand, I said, walking quickly toward the stairs to get away from my family's morning routine. Could you tell me who called or what specific concerns were raised? I can't provide the names of the individuals who contacted us as they requested confidentiality, but I can tell you that the concerns centered around emotional stability, truthfulness in representing achievements, and ability to handle pressure in professional environments. Each word hit me like a physical blow. Emotional stability, truthfulness, ability to handle pressure. These weren't vague concerns about technical skills or cultural fit. These were character assassinations designed to make me unemployable. Worthington, I can assure you that whatever information you received is either completely inaccurate or has been taken drastically out of context. I've never had performance issues related to emotional stability or honesty in any professional setting. Could you perhaps provide more specific details about what was alleged so I can address it properly? Brooke's voice drifted up from the kitchen, still filming her content about morning gratitude practices. The irony wasn't lost on me. I understand this must be frustrating, Diana said, her tone professional but not unkind. The individuals who called seemed genuinely concerned about your well-being and felt obligated to share their experiences. One caller mentioned episodes of emotional outbursts during stressful periods, and another expressed concerns about your tendency to exaggerate or misrepresent your contributions to projects. Episodes of emotional outbursts, tendency to exaggerate. Someone had painted a picture of me as an unstable fabricator, and they'd done it convincingly enough that TechFlow's HR department felt compelled to follow up. But who would do such a thing? And why? Miss Worthington, I need you to understand that these allegations are completely false. I've never had emotional outbursts in professional settings, and I've certainly never misrepresented my achievements. Whatever source provided this information either has me confused with someone else or has motivations that aren't related to my actual professional conduct. I appreciate you taking the time to address this, she replied. However, given the nature of the concerns and the fact that they came from multiple sources, we've decided it would be best to proceed with other candidates. I wanted to call you personally rather than simply sending a form letter. Multiple sources. Not one person with a grudge, but multiple people who had taken the time to call TechFlow and provide detailed negative information about me. The calculation behind it was chilling. Could you at least tell me when these calls were received? I asked, grasping for any information that might help me understand what had happened. The first call came in the day after your interview, and the second call was received the following morning. I'm sorry, Miss Caldwell. I wish you the best in your job search. The line went dead, leaving me standing on our staircase with my phone pressed to my ear and my world crumbling around me. The day after my interview, someone had called TechFlow within 24 hours of me walking out of that building feeling like I'd aced the most important interview of my life. Someone who knew exactly when I'd interviewed and exactly how to destroy my chances. I sank down onto the stairs, my legs suddenly unable to support me. The timing was too precise to be coincidental. Whoever had sabotaged me knew about my interview schedule, knew enough about my background to sound credible, and cared enough about derailing my career to make not one but 2 separate calls to TechFlow's HR department. From the kitchen, I could hear Brooke wrapping up her filming session, thanking her audience for watching and reminding them to check out her latest blog post about setting boundaries with negative people in your life. My parents' voices joined the conversation, offering praise for her content and discussing lunch plans. I sat on those stairs for a long time, staring at my phone and trying to process what had just happened. Someone had stolen my dream job, and they'd done it so efficiently and ruthlessly that TechFlow's HR department didn't even question the information they'd received. The professional reputation I'd spent years building had been destroyed in 2 phone calls, and I had no idea who was responsible or why they'd targeted me. But I was about to find out. The revelation came 3 weeks later, hidden in plain sight like poison in honey. I was sitting in Cafe Momentum downtown, nursing my 3rd cup of coffee and working on a freelance project that paid just enough to cover my cell phone bill. The cafe had become my unofficial office, offering free Wi-Fi and enough ambient noise to drown out the growing anxiety that followed me everywhere these days. I'd applied to 12 more positions since the TechFlow call, and the responses had been uniformly disappointing. Either complete silence or polite rejections that cited concerns about cultural fit or the need for candidates with more specific experience.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
It felt like every door in Austin's tech scene had suddenly slammed shut, and I couldn't understand why. That's when Tess and Gwen walked through the cafe door, scanning the room until her eyes found mine. Tessa had been my roommate during graduate school, and though we'd stayed in touch, we hadn't seen each other in person for months. She looked uncomfortable as she approached my table, clutching her phone in a way that suggested she had something difficult to share. "Zoe," she said, sliding into the chair across from me. "I need to show you something, and you're not going to like it." She placed her phone on the table between us, and I could see she'd pulled up a LinkedIn conversation thread. "My cousin works in HR at Meridian Technologies. You know that fintech startup on South Lamar? Anyway, she mentioned something weird that happened last week, and when I heard the details, I realized it involved you." My stomach clenched. Meridian Technologies was one of the companies I'd applied to the previous week. They'd rejected my application within 48 hours, citing an oversaturation of qualified candidates. "What kind of weird something?" I asked, though I was already dreading the answer. Tessa turned her phone so I could read the conversation. Her cousin had written about receiving an unusual call from someone claiming to be a former colleague of mine. The caller had expressed concerns about my professional stability and suggested that Meridian might want to reconsider my application. The timing was identical to what had happened at TechFlow. "Zoe, this person called my cousin pretending to be someone who had worked with you at a previous company. They provided specific details about your background that were accurate enough to sound credible, but then they completely fabricated stories about your work performance and personality." I stared at the phone screen, reading and rereading the messages. Someone was systematically contacting companies I'd applied to, posing as a former colleague, and destroying my reputation before I even had a chance to interview. The level of dedication required was staggering. They were monitoring my job applications, researching the companies I'd applied to, and making targeted calls to sabotage my prospects. "Did your cousin get any details about who called? A name or anything that might help identify them?" Tessa shook her head. The caller refused to provide their name, claiming they were concerned about retaliation. But here's the thing that really bothered my cousin. The person seemed to know specific details about Meridian's hiring process and company culture. They didn't just make generic complaints about you. They tailored their concerns to match exactly what Meridian values in their employees. The implications hit me like a sledgehammer. This wasn't random sabotage or a case of mistaken identity. Someone with intimate knowledge of my job search was deliberately and methodically destroying my career prospects. They knew where I was applying, they understood enough about each company to craft believable concerns, and they had the time and motivation to make multiple calls per week. "Tessa, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Have you mentioned my job search to anyone? Family, friends, co-workers, anyone who might have access to information about where I'm applying?" She considered the question carefully. "I don't think so. I mean, I've mentioned that you're looking for work in general terms, but I haven't shared specific company names or details." "Why would I? That's your private information." "What about social media? Have I posted anything that might indicate where I'm interviewing or applying?" Zoe, you barely post on social media. Your LinkedIn is professional but generic, and your Instagram is mostly pictures of your dog and coffee cups. There's no way someone could track your job applications through your online presence. But even as she said it, I realized there was one person who had access to all of that information. One person who lived in my house, who overheard my phone calls, who could easily see my computer screen when I worked on applications at the kitchen table. One person who had been present during every conversation I'd had with my parents about my job search, including specific company names and interview dates. The realization was so obvious and so devastating that I almost couldn't process it. But once the thought formed, everything else fell into place with horrible clarity. Tessa, I said slowly, I think I know who's been making those calls. The confrontation didn't happen immediately. Instead, I spent the next several days conducting my own investigation, driven by a combination of heartbreak and methodical fury that surprised me with its intensity. I started by creating a timeline of every job application I'd submitted over the past 2 months, cross-referencing it with my family's knowledge of my interview schedule and the timing of the sabotage calls. The pattern was unmistakable. Every company that had received negative calls about me was a company I'd mentioned by name during family dinners or conversations in our shared living spaces. Companies I'd applied to but never discussed at home had responded normally, some rejections, some interviews, some opportunities still pending. But every single company my family knew about had either rejected me immediately after the sabotage calls or had suddenly withdrawn their interest after initial positive responses. I also started paying closer attention to the conversations happening around me at home. Brooke's content creation had evolved to include more professional development themes, and she'd recently posted several videos about recognizing toxic people in your workplace and the importance of protecting company culture from disruptive influences. The language she used in those videos bore an uncomfortable resemblance to the concerns that had been raised about me with TechFlow and Meridian. But I needed proof, not just suspicions. So I set a trap. I created a fake job application to a fictional company, complete with a compelling cover letter and a detailed description of the position. Then during dinner one evening, I casually mentioned to my parents that I had a promising interview lined up with TechFlow Solutions, a boutique consulting firm that specialized in financial analytics for credit unions. I provided enough specific details to make the story believable: the interviewer's name, the location, the salary range, even the parking situation at their office building. Within 48 hours, I had my answer. I'd set up a Google Voice number and email address for the fictional TechFlow Solutions, and sure enough, I received a call from someone claiming to be concerned about my professional conduct. The caller, a woman with a voice I recognized but was still hoping I was wrong about, provided a detailed account of my alleged behavioral problems, complete with specific examples that painted me as emotionally unstable and dishonest. The caller was my mother. I recorded the conversation, sitting in my car outside a Target parking lot with my hands shaking as I listened to my own mother systematically destroy my professional reputation to a company that didn't exist. She was calm, articulate, and convincing. She expressed genuine concern for both my well-being and the potential impact my instability might have on TechFlow's team dynamics. She even offered to provide additional references if needed. When the call ended, I sat in that parking lot for over an hour, staring at my phone and trying to understand how we'd reached this point. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment or a misguided attempt to protect me from disappointment. This was calculated, sustained sabotage that had been going on for months. My own parents had been working actively to prevent me from building a career, and they'd been doing it with a level of planning and dedication that suggested they saw my professional success as a threat worth neutralizing. But why? What could they possibly gain from keeping me unemployed and financially dependent? What was so threatening about my potential success that they were willing to destroy my reputation to prevent it? The answer to that question would come later, hidden in a place I never thought to look. But first I had to decide what to do with the knowledge that my own family was sabotaging my future. The decision came easier than I expected. I didn't confront them. I didn't demand explanations or stage dramatic confrontations. Instead, I did something they probably never anticipated. I started planning. My family wanted to destroy my career prospects in Austin's traditional tech market, then I would build something they couldn't touch. If they wanted to control my financial future by keeping me dependent on their support, then I would create independence they couldn't sabotage. If they thought they could manipulate my professional reputation through whisper campaigns and anonymous phone calls, then I would build a reputation so solid and public that their lies would be obvious to anyone who cared to look. I was going to start my own consulting firm. The idea had been percolating in the back of my mind for months, ever since my third or fourth job rejection. I had specialized skills in fraud detection and financial modeling that were increasingly valuable in a world where cryptocurrency scams and sophisticated financial fraud were becoming more common. I had connections from graduate school who worked at smaller banks and credit unions that couldn't afford full-time data science teams but desperately needed expertise in detecting and preventing fraud. What I hadn't had was the motivation to take the risk of entrepreneurship. Starting a consulting firm meant giving up the security of traditional employment, building a client base from scratch, and taking responsibility for every aspect of running a business. It was scary and uncertain and completely outside my comfort zone. But sitting in that Target parking lot with a recording of my mother's betrayal on my phone, I realized that the security of traditional employment was an illusion anyway. If your own family was willing to sabotage your career, then no job was truly secure. If people who claimed to love you were actively working to undermine your success, then you couldn't build your future on anyone's foundation but your own. I drove home that evening with a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in months. I walked into our house, said polite hellos to my family, and went upstairs to my childhood bedroom. Then I opened my laptop and began building something they couldn't destroy. The first step was research. I spent the next week analyzing the market for independent fraud detection consulting in Texas, identifying potential clients and mapping out the competitive landscape. What I found was encouraging. There was significant demand for specialized expertise, particularly among smaller financial institutions that couldn't justify hiring full-time data scientists but needed sophisticated fraud prevention capabilities. I also researched the legal requirements for starting a consulting business in Texas, the insurance and licensing requirements for working with financial institutions, and the technological infrastructure I'd need to serve clients securely and effectively. It was overwhelming at first, but also exciting in a way that job hunting had never been. This wasn't about convincing someone else to give me an opportunity. This was about creating my own opportunities. The second step was building my portfolio. I reached out to 3 former classmates who worked at smaller banks and offered to conduct free fraud detection assessments for their institutions. The work was pro bono, but it gave me concrete case studies to demonstrate my capabilities and helped me refine my service offerings based on real client needs. The results were better than I'd hoped. The first bank I worked with discovered that their existing fraud detection systems were missing nearly 30% of suspicious transactions, and my recommendations helped them prevent an estimated $250,000 in losses over the following month. The second bank used my analysis to identify a sophisticated check-kiting scheme that their previous systems hadn't detected. The third bank was so impressed with my work that they offered me a paid contract to overhaul their entire fraud prevention infrastructure. Within 6 weeks, I had 3 paying clients and a waiting list of potential customers who had been referred by my initial pro bono work. I also had something I'd never possessed during my job search: complete control over my professional reputation. Nobody could call my clients and lie about my work performance because my work performance was visible and measurable. Nobody could sabotage my opportunities because I was creating my own opportunities. Nobody could undermine my success because my success was being built on my own terms, with my own skills, serving clients who valued my expertise because they'd experienced its benefits firsthand. I moved out of my family's house on a cold December morning, packing my belongings into my Honda Civic while Brooke filmed a morning routine video about the importance of setting healthy boundaries with family members who don't support your growth. The irony was so thick I could have cut it with a knife, but I didn't say anything. I just loaded my boxes and drove to my new apartment in Muller, a modest 1-bedroom place that I could afford with my consulting income, and that felt like a palace because it was entirely mine. My parents asked where I was going, but they didn't ask me to stay. Brooke asked if I'd be available to help with her content creation schedule, but she didn't ask why I was leaving. The lack of curiosity told me everything I needed to know about how they viewed my role in the family dynamic. But what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd stumbled across something during my final week in their house that changed everything I thought I understood about my situation. I found it while helping my father clear out Uncle Morris's storage unit. Uncle Morris had been my father's younger brother, a tech entrepreneur who died unexpectedly 3 years earlier from a heart attack at age 52. He'd never married, had no children, and had left his estate to my father with instructions to distribute his business assets among his nieces and nephews when they came of age. My father had been putting off dealing with Morris's business papers for years, but the storage unit rental was becoming expensive, and he'd finally decided to sort through everything and dispose of what wasn't needed. He'd asked me to help, probably because he knew I'd understand the technical documents better than anyone else in the family. What I found in that storage unit changed everything. Morris hadn't just been a successful entrepreneur. He'd been the founder and majority shareholder of 3 companies that had been acquired by larger tech firms over the past decade. His business documents revealed assets worth millions of dollars, including ongoing royalty payments from patents he'd developed and licensing agreements that continued to generate substantial income. But more importantly, I found his will. The will was clear and unambiguous. Morris had left his entire business portfolio to his nephew and nieces, to be distributed equally among Brooke and me when we reached age 25. The assets were being held in trust, managed by a law firm in downtown Austin, and should have been distributed to us years ago. Brooke had turned 25 6 months earlier. I'd turned 28 the previous spring. Neither of us had ever been contacted by Morris's lawyers or informed about our inheritance. I sat in that storage unit surrounded by boxes of financial documents and tried to process what I was looking at. My uncle had left us millions of dollars. Money that should have been distributed years ago. Money that would have made my job search irrelevant, would have given me the financial security to start my consulting firm without worrying about rent or health insurance, would have changed everything about my current situation. And my parents had never mentioned it. I photographed every relevant document with my phone, then helped my father load the remaining boxes into his truck without saying a word about what I'd discovered. He made casual conversation about Morris's pack rat tendencies and expressed relief about finally getting the storage unit cleaned out. There was no mention of wills or inheritances or trust funds. No indication that he remembered anything about assets that were supposed to be distributed to his daughters. That evening I called Whitmore & Associates, the law firm listed as the trustee in Morris's will. After being transferred through several departments, I finally reached an attorney who confirmed that yes, they had been managing Uncle Morris's estate, and yes, there were assets designated for distribution to his nieces. But they'd been instructed by the estate's executor, my father, that the beneficiaries were not yet ready to receive their inheritances. Not ready in what sense? I asked. The executor expressed concerns about the beneficiaries' emotional maturity and financial responsibility. He requested that distribution be delayed until both beneficiaries demonstrated greater stability in their personal and professional lives. Emotional maturity, financial responsibility. Stability, the same language my mother had used when sabotaging my job prospects. I asked for copies of all correspondence between the law firm and my father regarding the delayed distribution. What I received 3 days later was a file folder full of emails spanning the past 3 years, documenting my father's ongoing efforts to prevent Brooke and me from receiving our inheritance. His reasoning evolved over time, but the themes remained consistent. We were too young, too immature, too unstable to handle significant financial resources. He provided examples of our poor judgment, our emotional volatility, our tendency to make decisions without considering long-term consequences. He painted a picture of 2 daughters who needed continued parental guidance and financial oversight to prevent them from squandering their uncle's legacy. Most damning of all, he'd specifically cited my recent unemployment and unsuccessful job search as evidence of my inability to manage my own affairs. He'd told Morris's lawyers that I was struggling with depression, making poor career decisions, and demonstrating concerning patterns of behavior that suggested I wasn't ready for financial independence. The betrayal was so complete and systematic that it took my breath away. My parents hadn't just sabotaged my job search to keep me financially dependent. They'd kept me financially dependent by withholding an inheritance that would have made employment optional, then used my resulting dependence as justification for continued control. They'd engineered my failure, then pointed to that failure as evidence that I couldn't be trusted with success. But they'd made one crucial mistake. By keeping me unaware of the inheritance, they'd given me time to build something real. Something that demonstrated my actual capabilities rather than the fictional instability they'd constructed. Something that would make their lies about my competence and reliability look absurd when the truth finally came out. And the truth was about to come out in ways they never saw coming. I scheduled a meeting with Whitmore & Associates for the following Monday morning. I brought copies of my consulting contracts, testimonials from my clients, and financial records showing that I'd built a sustainable business from nothing in less than 3 months. I also brought copies of the recordings I'd made of my parents' sabotage calls, along with documented evidence of their systematic campaign to undermine my career. The lawyers were horrified. The level of manipulation and financial abuse was so egregious that they immediately began proceedings to remove my father as executor and distribute the inheritance according to Morris's original wishes. They also mentioned that my father's actions might constitute grounds for legal action, given that he'd used his position as executor to actively harm the beneficiary's financial prospects. But I had a better idea. Rather than pursuing immediate distribution of the inheritance, I proposed something different. I wanted to use my portion of Morris's assets to create something he would have been proud of, a venture capital fund focused on supporting women and underrepresented minorities in technology entrepreneurship. The fund would be called Morris Caldwell Ventures, and it would provide both financial support and mentorship to entrepreneurs who faced the kinds of systemic barriers that had nearly derailed my own career. I would serve as the fund's managing partner, drawing on my technical expertise and newfound business experience to identify promising investments and support portfolio companies. The lawyers loved the idea, particularly because it aligned with Morris's own values and philanthropic interests. More importantly, it meant that my inheritance wouldn't just change my life, it would create opportunities for dozens of other entrepreneurs who might otherwise struggle to access capital and support. But the most satisfying part of the arrangement was that it would make me one of the most influential venture capitalists in Austin's tech ecosystem practically overnight. Companies that had rejected my job applications would be coming to me for funding. HR departments that had believed anonymous lies about my character would be courting my investment dollars. And TechFlow Industries, the company where my dream job had been sabotaged by my own parents, would find themselves in the awkward position of needing something I now had the power to provide. The irony was about to become delicious. The launch of Morris Caldwell Ventures happened faster than anyone expected, including myself. Within 2 weeks of my meeting with Whitmore and Associates, the legal paperwork was finalized, the fund structure was established, and I found myself sitting in a downtown Austin office space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lady Bird Lake, officially managing $8 million in venture capital. The office itself was a study in understated elegance. Morris had apparently purchased the space years earlier as an investment property, and it had been sitting empty since his death. The lawyers handed me the keys along with the inheritance paperwork, mentioning almost casually that Uncle Morris had always intended for the space to house his next venture. Walking into that office felt like stepping into a destiny I'd never known was waiting for me. The first month was a whirlwind of learning curves and steep climbs. I'd built and run a successful consulting practice, but venture capital was an entirely different ecosystem with its own language, relationships, and unwritten rules. I spent my days studying deal structures, meeting with entrepreneurs, and building relationships with other investors in Austin's rapidly expanding tech scene. What surprised me most was how quickly word spread about the new fund. Austin's startup ecosystem was tight-knit enough that news traveled fast, and within weeks I was receiving dozens of pitches from entrepreneurs seeking funding. Some were brilliant innovations that made me excited about the future of technology. Others were barely coherent ideas scribbled on napkins by people who'd watched too many episodes of Shark Tank. But each meeting taught me something new about evaluating opportunities and understanding market dynamics. More importantly, I was building a reputation that had nothing to do with my family's opinion of my capabilities. Every successful investment decision, every thoughtful piece of advice I offered to portfolio companies, every strategic introduction I made between entrepreneurs and potential partners, strengthened my standing in the community. I wasn't Zoe Caldwell, the unemployed daughter living in her parents' house. I was Zoe Caldwell, managing partner of Morris Caldwell Ventures, and people respected my expertise because they'd experienced its value firsthand. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was thriving in exactly the kind of high-pressure, high-stakes environment my parents had claimed I couldn't handle. Every day brought decisions that could make or break someone's business dreams, negotiations that required both analytical precision and emotional intelligence, and networking events, where building genuine relationships was the difference between success and failure. If I'd truly been the emotionally unstable, dishonest person they'd described to potential employers, I would have crashed and burned within weeks. Instead, I was building something extraordinary. My first major investment was in a cybersecurity startup, founded by two women who'd met while working at Dell. Their technology could detect and prevent credential stuffing attacks in real time, something that every financial institution desperately needed but few could afford to develop in-house. The founders were brilliant, passionate, and completely bootstrapped, trying to build their company while working full-time jobs and raising small children. I invested $500,000 in their Series A round, but more importantly, I connected them with 3 potential customers from my consulting network. Within 6 months, they'd closed 2 major contracts and raised additional funding from a Silicon Valley firm that valued the company at 10 times what it had been worth when I first invested. My stake in the company had grown to over $2 million, but the real satisfaction came from watching 2 talented women build something meaningful, without having to compromise their vision or give up equity to investors who didn't understand their market. The second investment was in a fintech startup that used machine learning to help small businesses detect and prevent payment fraud. The founder was a brilliant engineer who'd left Facebook to solve problems for companies that couldn't afford enterprise-level fraud prevention. His technology was elegant and effective, but he was struggling to navigate the complex world of financial regulations and compliance requirements. I invested $600,000 and spent the next several months helping him understand the regulatory landscape, connecting him with compliance experts, and introducing him to potential customers in the credit union and community banking space. The company grew from 3 employees to 15 in less than a year, and their technology was now protecting over $50 million in transactions monthly. But it was my third investment that would ultimately change everything. TechFlow Industries had been growing rapidly since I'd interviewed there 8 months earlier. Their fraud detection technology was gaining traction with major banks, and they'd recently announced plans to expand into cryptocurrency security and international markets. But their growth was straining their technical infrastructure, and they needed significant capital to scale their operations without compromising the quality of their fraud detection algorithms. When Harrison Reed, TechFlow's CEO, reached out to schedule a meeting about potential investment opportunities, I accepted without hesitation. This wasn't about revenge or vindication, though I won't pretend those thoughts didn't cross my mind. This was about business. TechFlow was building exactly the kind of technology that aligned with Morris Caldwell Ventures' investment thesis, and their growth trajectory suggested they could provide exceptional returns for our fund. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday morning in February, almost exactly 9 months after my disastrous phone call with Diana Worthington from HR. I arrived at TechFlow's offices 15 minutes early, carrying a leather portfolio that contained my analysis of their technology, market position, and growth potential. The same receptionist who'd greeted me for my job interview checked me in, though she showed no signs of recognizing me from our previous encounter. Harrison Reed met me in the lobby personally, which was unusual for a CEO, but suggested he was taking the potential investment seriously. He was younger than I'd expected, probably in his early 40s, with the kind of focused energy that successful entrepreneurs radiate when they're building something they truly believe in. "Miss Caldwell," he said, extending his hand with a genuine smile. "Thank you for taking the time to meet with us. I've been following Morris Caldwell Ventures since you launched, and I'm impressed with the quality of your investments and the support you provide to your portfolio companies." We walked through the same corridors I'd navigated during my job interview, past the same conference rooms where I'd presented my fraud detection algorithms to a team that had ultimately rejected me based on lies my parents had told their HR department. The offices were busier now, with at least twice as many employees as I'd seen during my previous visit, and the energy was palpable. This was a company that was scaling rapidly and needed capital to maintain their momentum. Harrison led me to a corner conference room with whiteboards covered in technical diagrams and growth projections. 3 other people were waiting for us. Elena Santos, the CTO, I'd interviewed with months earlier, Marcus Chen, the CFO, and Diana Worthington, the HR director who delivered the news that my parents had sabotaged my job prospects. Diana's face showed a flicker of recognition when I entered the room, but she maintained her professional composure. Elena and Marcus greeted me warmly, clearly excited about the potential partnership. Harrison gestured for me to take a seat at the head of the conference table, a subtle but unmistakable sign of respect for my position as a potential investor. Before we dive into the specifics, Harrison began, "I want to say that we've done our homework on Morris Caldwell Ventures. Your track record with cybersecurity and fintech investments is exactly what we're looking for in a strategic partner. We're not just seeking capital, we want investors who understand our market and can help us navigate the challenges of scaling in the financial services space. Elena picked up the presentation, walking me through TechFlow's technology roadmap and explaining how they plan to expand their fraud detection capabilities into new markets. Her passion for the work was evident, and her technical knowledge was impressive. This was exactly the kind of innovative thinking that made companies successful in the long term. Marcus presented the financial projections, showing steady revenue growth and a clear path to profitability. The numbers were solid, and their customer acquisition strategy was both realistic and ambitious. They were seeking $12 million in Series B funding, which would give them 18 months of runway to execute their expansion plans and position themselves for acquisition or IPO. I asked detailed questions about their technology stack, their competitive advantages, and their plans for international expansion. My consulting experience with fraud detection gave me insights that impressed the team, and I could see them beginning to view me not just as a potential source of capital, but as someone who could genuinely contribute to their strategic thinking. But there was an elephant in the room that no one was addressing directly. I have one additional question, I said, setting down my pen and looking directly at Diana. What's your process for evaluating potential employees and ensuring that your hiring decisions are based on accurate information? The question hung in the air for a moment. Diana shifted uncomfortably in her seat, and I could see recognition dawning in her expression. She knew exactly why I was asking, and she knew that I knew about the phone calls that had cost me the job I'd interviewed for in this very building. We have rigorous background check procedures, she said carefully. We verify employment history, conduct reference checks with former supervisors, and occasionally receive unsolicited information from individuals who have worked with candidates previously. And how do you verify the accuracy of unsolicited information, particularly when the sources request anonymity? Harrison and Elena exchanged glances, clearly sensing undercurrents they didn't fully understand. Marcus looked puzzled, but interested. We take all information seriously, Diana continued, but we also understand that anonymous sources can sometimes have motivations that aren't aligned with providing accurate assessments of a candidate's qualifications. That's an interesting perspective, I said, maintaining a neutral tone. It suggests you've learned from past experiences where inaccurate information might have affected hiring decisions. The silence that followed was loaded with implications. Diana's face had gone pale, and I could see her mental calculations as she tried to determine how much I knew and what I planned to do with that knowledge. Harrison finally broke the tension. Is there something specific we should be aware of regarding our hiring practices? I smiled, an expression that was professional but carried just enough edge to make my point clear. Not at all. I just believe that successful companies are built on accurate information and sound decision-making. I'm confident that TechFlow has learned to distinguish between credible concerns and malicious interference. Diana nodded quickly, perhaps too quickly. Absolutely, we've definitely refined our processes to ensure we're making decisions based on verifiable information. Excellent, I said, returning to my notes.
In that case, let's discuss the investment terms. The rest of the meeting proceeded smoothly. We negotiated equity percentages, board representation, and milestone-based funding tranches. TechFlow was seeking a $12 million investment in exchange for 15% equity and one board seat. After 2 hours of discussion, we'd outlined terms that worked for both parties, pending final due diligence and legal review. As the meeting concluded, Harrison walked me back to the lobby while the others gathered their materials. I have to ask, he said as we waited for the elevator. You seem to have some history with our company. Should I be concerned about any potential conflicts of interest? I considered how much to reveal. Harrison seemed like a decent person, and TechFlow was exactly the kind of company I wanted to support with Morris Caldwell Ventures. But I also wanted him to understand that his HR department had made serious mistakes that could have legal and reputational consequences if they weren't addressed properly. I interviewed here about 9 months ago for a senior data analytics position, I said. The interview process went well, but I ultimately wasn't selected for the role. There's no conflict of interest from my perspective. This is purely a business decision based on TechFlow's growth potential and strategic fit with our fund's investment thesis. I see, Harrison said, though his expression suggested he was filing this information away for future consideration. Well, I hope you'll consider our proposal favorably. I think we could accomplish great things together. The elevator arrived, and as the doors opened, I turned back to Harrison with one final comment. I'm sure we can. Just make sure your hiring decisions moving forward are based on a candidate's actual qualifications rather than anonymous phone calls from people with personal agendas. You might be surprised by the talent you discover when you focus on merit rather than gossip. The elevator doors closed before he could respond, but I saw understanding flash across his face in the final moment before we lost eye contact. 3 days later, Elena Santos called my office directly. "Zoe," she said, her voice careful but determined. "Harrison asked me to conduct some additional research into our previous interactions, and I discovered something that I think you should know." She'd found records of my original interview and the subsequent reference calls that had led to my rejection. More importantly, she'd traced the phone numbers used for those calls and discovered that they traced back to landlines registered to Glenn and Patricia Caldwell in Westlake Hills. "I want you to know that if we'd had accurate information about your qualifications and character, the outcome of your interview process would have been very different," Elena said. "Your technical expertise was exactly what we needed, and your consulting work since then has only reinforced my conviction that we made a mistake." "I appreciate you telling me that," I replied, "but I'm not looking for apologies or explanations. I'm interested in whether TechFlow is the kind of company that learns from its mistakes and implements better processes going forward." "We are," she said, without hesitation. "Diana has already updated our reference check procedures to require verified contact information and documented employment relationships for all sources. We've also implemented additional safeguards to prevent anonymous sources from influencing hiring decisions." That's encouraging. It suggests TechFlow is committed to making decisions based on accurate information and sound judgment. There was a pause before Elena continued. "Zoe, I hope our past mistakes won't prevent you from considering the investment opportunity. I think we could learn a lot from working with you, and not just about fraud detection technology. The investment decision will be based entirely on TechFlow's business potential and strategic fit with our fund's objectives," I assured her. "Past hiring mistakes are relevant only insofar as they reflect the company's ability to learn and improve its decision-making processes. And what's your assessment of our learning and improvement?" I considered the question carefully. TechFlow had implemented better hiring practices, their leadership had acknowledged past mistakes, and they were seeking not just my capital but my expertise. More importantly, they were willing to have difficult conversations about their failures rather than pretending those failures hadn't occurred. I think TechFlow has demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership and adaptability that makes companies successful in the long term, I said. "I'll have an answer on the investment proposal by the end of the week." But I already knew what that answer would be. The due diligence process took another 3 weeks, during which my team of analysts and I examined every aspect of TechFlow's business. We reviewed their financial statements, analyzed their technology architecture, interviewed their customers, and assessed their competitive position. What we found confirmed my initial assessment. TechFlow was exactly the kind of company that aligned with Morris Caldwell Ventures' investment philosophy. More importantly, the due diligence process gave me opportunities to spend time with TechFlow's team and observe their company culture firsthand. What I saw was a group of talented, passionate people who were building something meaningful and who treated each other with respect and professionalism. The toxic dynamics that had allowed anonymous phone calls to derail hiring decisions seemed to have been replaced with more transparent and accountable processes. I also learned that TechFlow's growth had attracted interest from several other investors, including 2 Silicon Valley venture capital firms with significantly more capital than Morris Caldwell Ventures. Harrison and his team could have taken funding from investors who offered more money and fewer questions. The fact that they were prioritizing strategic fit and cultural alignment over pure financial considerations told me everything I needed to know about their values and long-term thinking. On a Friday afternoon in early March, I called Harrison to schedule a final meeting. "I'd like to present our investment decision to your full leadership team," I told him. "Are you available Monday morning for a meeting that might run longer than our previous discussions?" "Of course," Harrison replied, and I could hear cautious optimism in his voice. "Should I interpret this as good news?" "You should interpret it as the beginning of a partnership that I think will be beneficial for both of our organizations." Monday morning arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of Austin weather that made everyone grateful for indoor meetings and hot coffee. I arrived at TechFlow's offices, carrying a folder that contained not just investment documents but a comprehensive strategic plan for how Morris Caldwell Ventures could support TechFlow's growth beyond simply providing capital. The same conference room that had hosted our initial meeting now held 6 people: Harrison, Elena, Marcus, Diana, and 2 additional executives I hadn't met previously. The atmosphere was expectant but professional, and I could sense the nervous energy that accompanies potentially life-changing announcements. Before I share our investment decision, I want to explain the philosophy behind Morris Caldwell Ventures and why we're selective about the companies we choose to support. I walked them through Uncle Morris's vision for supporting entrepreneurs who were building meaningful technology to solve real problems. I explained our focus on companies that demonstrated both technical excellence and ethical leadership, and our commitment to providing not just capital but strategic support to help our portfolio companies achieve their full potential. Morris Caldwell Ventures is prepared to invest $12 million in TechFlow Industries in exchange for 15% equity and 1 board seat, I announced. But our support will extend far beyond the financial investment. I outlined the strategic partnerships I could facilitate through my network of financial services contacts, the technical expertise I could provide based on my fraud detection consulting experience, and the additional funding opportunities I could help TechFlow access as they continued to scale. The relief and excitement in the room was palpable. Harrison and Elena exchanged smiles that suggested they'd been hoping for this outcome but hadn't wanted to assume anything. Marcus was already making notes about how the funding would accelerate their growth timeline. Even Diana looked genuinely pleased, though I noticed she was careful to maintain professional composure. There's one additional aspect of this partnership that I want to address, I continued, looking directly at Diana. Morris Caldwell Ventures believes that successful companies are built on the foundation of sound decision-making and accurate information. We expect our portfolio companies to maintain the highest standards of integrity in all their business practices, including hiring and human resources. Diana nodded seriously. We're committed to maintaining those standards. We've implemented new processes to ensure our hiring decisions are based on verified, accurate information, and we're always looking for ways to improve our practices. I'm glad to hear that, I replied. Because one of the things I'll be watching closely as a board member is how TechFlow identifies and attracts top talent. The technology sector is incredibly competitive, and companies that can consistently hire the best people will have significant advantages over those that rely on incomplete or inaccurate information. The message was clear without being confrontational. TechFlow's success would depend partly on their ability to make good hiring decisions, and I would be in a position to observe and influence those decisions going forward. Harrison leaned forward with obvious enthusiasm. When can we finalize the paperwork and get the funding process started? Our legal team will have the investment documents ready for review by Wednesday, I said. Assuming everything looks good on your end, we can close the transaction by the end of next week. This is fantastic news, Elena said. I'm excited about the strategic support you mentioned. Having someone with your fraud detection expertise available for consultation could help us avoid some of the technical pitfalls that derail other companies in our space. That's exactly the kind of partnership Uncle Morris envisioned when he established the fund, I replied. Our portfolio companies aren't just investments, they're collaborations. As the meeting concluded and people began gathering their materials, Harrison approached me with a thoughtful expression. Zoe, I want you to know that I've been thinking about our previous conversation regarding hiring practices and accurate information. I've asked Diana to conduct a comprehensive review of all our HR processes, and if we discover that we've made mistakes in the past that affected qualified candidates, we'll take appropriate steps to address those situations. I appreciated his directness. That kind of proactive leadership is exactly why Morris Caldwell Ventures is excited to partner with TechFlow. Companies that are willing to examine their practices and make improvements tend to be the ones that achieve sustained success. I hope this partnership will help us become the kind of company that deserves the trust you're placing in us. As I walked back to my car, I reflected on how dramatically my circumstances had changed over the past year. 12 months earlier, I'd been living in my childhood bedroom, financially dependent on parents who were actively sabotaging my career prospects. Now I was a venture capitalist with a growing portfolio of successful investments and the resources to support the next generation of entrepreneurs. But the most satisfying aspect of the transformation wasn't the money or the prestige. It was the knowledge that I'd built something meaningful from nothing. Something that created opportunities for other people rather than just enriching myself. Uncle Morris would have been proud of what his legacy was accomplishing. The irony that TechFlow had become one of my portfolio companies wasn't lost on me, but it also wasn't the point. The point was that good companies with solid fundamentals and ethical leadership deserved support, regardless of past mistakes. TechFlow was building technology that made the financial system safer for everyone, and that alignment with the public good was more important than any personal vindication I might derive from the investment. Still, I had to admit there was a certain satisfaction in knowing that I would now be sitting in TechFlow's boardroom as an equal partner, helping to guide the strategic decisions that would determine the company's future. Diana Worthington would be presenting HR updates to a board that included the person whose career she'd tried to derail based on anonymous phone calls from people with personal agendas. The satisfaction wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. It was about the knowledge that merit and capability ultimately matter more than manipulation and sabotage. It was about proving that people who try to tear others down often end up creating opportunities for those they underestimated to rise even higher. But my parents still didn't know about any of it. They didn't know about Uncle Morris's inheritance, Morris Caldwell Ventures, or my growing influence in Austin's tech ecosystem. As far as they knew, I was still struggling with my consulting practice, still financially insecure, still the daughter who couldn't handle the responsibilities of a real job. That was about to change in ways they never saw coming. The first TechFlow board meeting took place on a Wednesday morning in April, 6 weeks after the investment had been finalized. I arrived at their downtown offices carrying a briefcase that contained quarterly reports, strategic recommendations, and a comprehensive analysis of the competitive landscape in fraud detection technology. The conference room had been reconfigured with a proper boardroom table and executive chairs, reflecting TechFlow's evolution from scrappy startup to serious enterprise. Harrison Reed called the meeting to order at 9 sharp, and I took my seat at the table with the confidence of someone who belonged there. The other board members included Harrison, Elena Santos as CTO, Marcus Chen as CFO, and 2 additional outside investors who had participated in earlier funding rounds. Diana Worthington attended as an observer, responsible for presenting HR metrics and hiring updates. The meeting proceeded through standard agenda items, financial performance, customer acquisition metrics, product development milestones, and operational challenges. TechFlow was exceeding their revenue projections by 12%, largely due to 2 major contracts they'd secured with regional banks that needed immediate fraud detection upgrades. Their technology was performing flawlessly, processing over 100 million transactions monthly with detection accuracy rates that surpassed industry standards. But it was Diana's HR presentation that proved most interesting. She stood at the front of the room with a PowerPoint presentation that detailed TechFlow's hiring metrics over the past quarter. The company had grown from 63 employees to 87, with particularly strong additions in their engineering and customer success teams. Their employee satisfaction scores were above industry averages, and their retention rates suggested they were building a positive company culture. One area where we've made significant improvements, Diana said, clicking to a slide titled Enhanced Hiring Processes, is in our reference verification and background check procedures. We've implemented new protocols that require documented employment relationships and verified contact information for all professional references. She looked directly at me as she continued. We've also established clear guidelines for handling unsolicited information about candidates, including requirements for documentation and corroboration before such information can influence hiring decisions. The slide changed to show hiring statistics, time to fill metrics, offer acceptance rates, and diversity benchmarks. What caught my attention was a small footnote, indicating that TechFlow had conducted a comprehensive review of their hiring practices over the past year, and had identified several cases where improved processes might have led to different outcomes. Have you taken any steps to address situations where previous hiring decisions might have been based on incomplete or inaccurate information? I asked, my tone professional but pointed. Diana's composure remained steady, but I could see the slight tightness around her eyes that suggested she understood exactly what I was asking. We've reviewed our processes and identified areas for improvement, but we believe it's more productive to focus on implementing better practices going forward rather than relitigating past decisions. That's certainly one approach, I replied. However, companies that are serious about building diverse, high-performing teams sometimes find value in reaching out to previously overlooked candidates, particularly when those candidates have demonstrated their capabilities in other contexts. Harrison leaned forward with interest. Are you suggesting we might have missed opportunities to hire qualified people due to process failures? I'm suggesting that any company that's serious about talent acquisition should periodically review whether their hiring processes are identifying the best candidates or inadvertently filtering out people who could contribute significantly to the organization's success. Elena Santos, who had been taking notes throughout the presentation, looked up with a thoughtful expression. Actually, that raises an interesting point. We're planning to expand our data science team significantly over the next 6 months. If we've previously overlooked qualified candidates due to process issues, it might be worth revisiting some of those applications. That's exactly the kind of proactive thinking that distinguishes great companies from merely good ones, I said, making eye contact with each board member. The technology sector is incredibly competitive, and companies that can consistently identify and attract top talent have substantial advantages over those that rely on less rigorous evaluation methods. Marcus Chen nodded in agreement. Our growth projections assume we'll be able to hire 15 additional engineers and data scientists by the end of the year. If our previous processes were filtering out qualified candidates, we should definitely address that before we start the new hiring cycle. Diana shifted uncomfortably, but maintained her professional demeanor. I'll be happy to work with Elena to review our talent pipeline and identify any candidates who might warrant reconsideration. Excellent, Harrison said. Diana, please prepare a comprehensive analysis of our hiring practices over the past year, including any cases where we might benefit from reaching out to previously considered candidates. Let's schedule a follow-up discussion for our next board meeting. The conversation moved on to other topics, but I could see Diana making notes that suggested she understood the implications of what had just been discussed. TechFlow's board had essentially directed her to identify and potentially rectify hiring mistakes, with particular attention to cases where qualified candidates might have been rejected due to process failures. After the meeting concluded, Elena approached me as others were gathering their materials. Zoe, I want to follow up on the hiring discussion. When you mentioned reaching out to previously overlooked candidates, were you thinking of anyone specific? I considered how direct to be. Elena had always struck me as someone who valued honesty and straightforward communication, and she'd been the one to discover the truth about my original interview experience. I think TechFlow should focus on identifying the most qualified candidates available, regardless of when they first applied, or what information might have influenced previous decisions, I said carefully. If someone has demonstrated strong technical capabilities and professional growth since their initial application, that suggests they might be worth reconsidering. That makes sense, Elena replied. We're specifically looking for senior-level data scientists with fraud detection experience. Do you know anyone in your network who might be interested in exploring opportunities with TechFlow? The question hung in the air between us. Elena knew exactly who I was and what my background included, but she was giving me the opportunity to approach this conversation on my own terms rather than making assumptions about my interest or availability. I said with a slight smile. Let me think about it and get back to you. The conversation was interrupted by Harrison, who approached with the kind of focused energy that suggested he had something important to discuss. Zoe, do you have a few minutes? I'd like to get your thoughts on something that came up during the hiring discussion. We walked to his office, a corner space with windows overlooking the Austin skyline, and walls lined with awards and recognition from industry organizations. Harrison gestured for me to take a seat in one of the leather chairs facing his desk. I want to be direct about something, he began. After our conversation about hiring practices, I asked Diana to pull the records from your interview last year. What I found was disturbing. He opened a folder on his desk and removed several printed pages. According to these records, you interviewed exceptionally well. Elena's technical evaluation was glowing, the team interview feedback was overwhelmingly positive, and your portfolio demonstration was exactly what we were looking for in a senior data analyst. Harrison paused, looking directly at me. But then we received 2 reference calls that painted a completely different picture of your professional capabilities and character. The caller information was minimal, but the specific concerns raised were detailed enough that our HR team felt obligated to reconsider the hiring decision. And what's your assessment of those reference calls now? I asked. Given what I know about your subsequent professional achievements and the quality of work you've done with Morris Caldwell Ventures, I think those calls were either based on inaccurate information or were deliberately intended to sabotage your candidacy. The admission was more direct than I'd expected, and it confirmed what I'd suspected about Harrison's character. He was willing to acknowledge mistakes and take responsibility for their consequences rather than deflecting or making excuses. What would you like to do with that assessment? I asked. Harrison leaned back in his chair, considering his words carefully. I'd like to offer you the position you should have been offered 9 months ago. Senior Data Analytics Manager, leading our fraud detection algorithm development, with a team of 8, and the salary and equity package we discussed during your original interview. The offer was unexpected, though perhaps it shouldn't have been. TechFlow needed experienced data scientists. I had exactly the qualifications they were seeking, and my success with Morris Caldwell Ventures had only strengthened my credentials. From a purely business perspective, offering me the position made perfect sense. But from my perspective, the situation was far more complex. Harrison, I appreciate the offer, and I'm grateful that you've taken the time to investigate what happened during my original interview process. However, my circumstances have changed significantly since then.
I gestured toward the windows overlooking downtown Austin. 9 months ago, I was looking for employment because I needed the financial security and professional development opportunities that come with a good job. Today, I'm running a successful venture capital fund, managing multiple portfolio companies, and building something that extends far beyond any single position. I understand that, Harrison replied, but I also think TechFlow could benefit tremendously from having your expertise as part of our internal team, and you might find the technical challenges more engaging than purely investment-focused work. It was a thoughtful response that acknowledged both my current success and the possibility that I might be interested in returning to hands-on technical work. But what Harrison didn't understand was that the issue wasn't just about career preferences or financial considerations. The position you're offering would make me an employee, I said carefully. But as a board member and investor, I'm a partner. I have input into strategic decisions, oversight of company policies, and the ability to influence TechFlow's direction in ways that align with my values and vision. Harrison nodded slowly, beginning to understand the broader implications. You're saying that taking the job would actually be a step backward in terms of your ability to shape the company's future. I'm saying that my current relationship with TechFlow allows me to contribute in ways that extend beyond technical expertise. As a board member, I can help ensure that the company's hiring practices, corporate culture, and strategic decisions reflect the highest standards of integrity and excellence. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, during which Harrison and I explored various ways I might contribute to TechFlow's technical development without giving up my role as an investor and board member. We discussed consulting arrangements, advisory positions, and collaborative projects that would allow me to leverage my fraud detection expertise while maintaining my independence. What emerged from the discussion was a hybrid arrangement that neither of us had initially considered. Morris Caldwell Ventures would provide ongoing technical consulting to TechFlow, with me personally leading projects that required specialized fraud detection expertise. This would give TechFlow access to my technical capabilities while allowing me to maintain my role as an investor and strategic advisor. The arrangement would also create an additional revenue stream for Morris Caldwell Ventures, demonstrating to other portfolio companies that we could provide both capital and specialized technical support. It was exactly the kind of value-added partnership that Uncle Morris had envisioned when he established the fund. But perhaps most importantly, the consulting arrangement would give me regular opportunities to observe TechFlow's operations and culture firsthand. As a board member, I received quarterly reports and attended monthly meetings. As a technical consultant, I would be working directly with their teams and could monitor their hiring practices, employee treatment, and operational integrity on an ongoing basis. I think this could work well for both of us, Harrison said as we shook hands. You get to stay involved in cutting-edge technical work while maintaining your role as an investor, and we get access to expertise that would be difficult to hire internally. And TechFlow gets a board member who's deeply familiar with your technical challenges and operational realities, I added. It should make our strategic discussions more informed and practical. As I left TechFlow's offices that afternoon, I reflected on how dramatically the power dynamics had shifted since my original interview. 9 months earlier, I'd been a job seeker hoping to convince them that I was worthy of employment. Now I was a strategic partner with the authority to influence their direction and the expertise to solve their most complex technical challenges. The transformation hadn't happened through revenge or manipulation.
It had happened through competence, hard work, and the systematic construction of value that others recognized and wanted to access. TechFlow wasn't offering me opportunities because they felt guilty about their past mistakes. They were offering me opportunities because my current capabilities made me valuable to their future success. But there was still one aspect of the story that remained unresolved. My parents continued to believe that I was struggling with my consulting practice, financially insecure, and unable to handle the responsibilities of a real job. They had no idea that I was now managing millions of dollars in investments, sitting on corporate boards, and building strategic partnerships with some of Austin's most successful technology companies. That ignorance was about to become a problem for them in ways they couldn't possibly anticipate. The first hint that my family's perception of my circumstances was dangerously outdated came during a Sunday dinner in late April. I'd been maintaining minimal contact with my parents since moving out of their house, limiting our interactions to brief phone calls and occasional family gatherings that I attended mostly to avoid creating unnecessary drama. Brooke had invited me to dinner at our parents' house, ostensibly to celebrate her reaching 100,000 followers on Instagram. The milestone was genuinely impressive, and her lifestyle brand had evolved into a legitimate business with sponsorship deals and affiliate marketing agreements that generated substantial income. She'd recently signed with a talent management agency and was exploring opportunities in brand partnerships and media appearances. I arrived at the family house carrying a bottle of wine and a congratulatory card, prepared to spend a few hours celebrating Brooke's success before returning to my own life. The dinner conversation focused primarily on her growing influence in the lifestyle and productivity space, with my parents asking detailed questions about her business strategy and future plans. The agency thinks I could transition into motivational speaking, Brooke explained over dessert. They want to book me for corporate events and women's conferences, talking about building authentic personal brands and maintaining work-life balance. That sounds like a natural extension of your content, my mother said approvingly. You've always been good at helping people see the positive aspects of challenging situations. The comment struck me as oddly pointed, though I couldn't determine whether it was intentional or simply my mother's tendency to turn every conversation into a teachable moment about resilience and optimism. Speaking of challenging situations, my father said, turning his attention to me for the first time that evening, how are things going with your consulting work? Are you finding enough clients to make it sustainable? The question was delivered with the tone of concerned parental interest, but I could hear underlying assumptions about my financial stability and professional prospects. In their minds, I was still the struggling daughter who'd been unable to secure traditional employment and had resorted to freelance work as a last resort. Business is going well, I replied neutrally. I've been able to expand beyond individual consulting projects into more strategic partnerships and investment opportunities. Investment opportunities? Brooke asked with surprise. I didn't realize you had enough capital to be making investments. I've been fortunate to connect with some interesting opportunities in the technology sector, I said, keeping my response deliberately vague. Austin's startup ecosystem is growing rapidly, and there are a lot of companies that need specialized expertise in fraud detection and financial analytics. My mother exchanged a glance with my father that suggested they were concerned about my financial judgment. The idea that I might be making investments with money I supposedly didn't have was clearly troubling to them. Zoe, I hope you're being careful about any investment decisions, my mother said gently. I know you're eager to build financial security, but investing in startups can be very risky, especially when you're still establishing your own business. Young companies fail at very high rates, my father added. Even experienced investors lose money regularly in the technology sector. You might want to focus on building a stable consulting practice before you start trying to evaluate investment opportunities. Their concern was touching in its way, but it was also based on a fundamental misunderstanding of my current circumstances. They thought I was a struggling consultant who might be making poor financial decisions with limited resources. They had no idea that I was managing an $8 million venture capital fund and sitting on the boards of multiple successful companies. I appreciate your concern, I said diplomatically. I'm being very careful about any financial decisions, and I have good advisors helping me evaluate opportunities. That's smart, Brooke said. I've been thinking about making some investments myself, now that my business is generating steady income. Maybe we could share resources and research opportunities together. The suggestion was well-intentioned, but it highlighted the gulf between their perception of my circumstances and my actual situation. Brooke was thinking about making small investments with her influencer income. I was evaluating $12 million funding rounds and negotiating board positions with companies that processed billions of dollars in transactions. I'd be happy to share what I've learned about evaluating investment opportunities, I replied. The technology sector has some interesting dynamics that aren't always obvious from the outside. The conversation moved on to other topics, but I could see my parents filing away their concerns about my supposedly risky financial behavior. They were clearly worried that I was overextending myself financially and making investment decisions that could jeopardize my precarious consulting business. Their protective instincts were admirable, but their complete ignorance of my actual circumstances was becoming a liability. At some point, my growing prominence in Austin's business community would intersect with their social and professional networks. When that happened, the disconnect between their understanding of my situation and my actual achievements could create awkward and potentially damaging situations for everyone involved. More immediately, their continued belief that I was financially struggling was influencing their behavior in ways that could have serious consequences. If they thought I was desperate for income and stability, they might be tempted to help me in ways that could interfere with my actual business relationships. The concern proved prescient 2 weeks later, when Elena Santos called my office with an unusual request. "Zoe, I received a strange phone call yesterday that I wanted to discuss with you," she said, her tone suggesting the conversation was both delicate and important. "Someone called our main number asking to speak with me specifically about your consulting contract with TechFlow." My stomach tightened. What kind of questions were they asking? The caller claimed to be conducting a reference check for another company that was considering hiring you for a consulting project. They wanted to know about the quality of your work, your reliability, and whether we'd experienced any issues with your professional conduct. The pattern was horribly familiar. Someone was conducting unauthorized reference checks on my professional relationships, potentially trying to sabotage my consulting business the same way they'd sabotaged my job search the previous year. "Did you provide any information to the caller?" I asked. "Of course not," Elena replied firmly. "I told them that TechFlow doesn't provide reference information to unauthorized third parties, and I suggested they contact you directly if they needed professional references." "Did the caller provide any information about which company they represented or what specific position they were evaluating me for?" "They claimed to be from the HR department of Meridian Financial, conducting due diligence for a fraud detection consulting contract. But when I asked for their name and contact information so I could verify the request with their company, they became evasive and hung up." Meridian Financial was a mid-sized credit union that I'd worked with briefly 6 months earlier, before my venture capital career had taken off. It was exactly the kind of organization someone might use as a cover story for unauthorized reference checking, particularly if they'd done enough research to know about my previous consulting relationships. "Elena, I need to ask you something directly, and I hope you'll be honest with me. Did anything about the caller's voice or manner suggest they might not be who they claim to be?" There was a pause before Elena responded. "Actually, yes. The caller seemed to have a lot of specific information about your background and our consulting relationship, but they asked questions that didn't make sense for someone conducting a legitimate reference check. It felt more like someone fishing for negative information than someone trying to verify your qualifications." "What kind of specific information did they seem to have?" "They knew about the timing of our consulting contract, the general scope of the fraud detection work you'd done for us, and even some details about our board structure. But they asked whether you'd had any emotional outbursts during meetings, or whether we'd had concerns about your honesty or reliability. The same character assassination themes that had destroyed my job prospects the previous year. Someone was conducting a systematic campaign to undermine my professional reputation, and they were using information that suggested intimate familiarity with my business relationships and consulting activities. Elena, I want you to know that if you receive any more calls like this, the information being provided is deliberately false and designed to damage my professional reputation. I'd appreciate it if you could document any future contact and let me know immediately." "Of course," she replied. "But Zoe, is there something you need to tell me about what's happening? This kind of deliberate sabotage suggests someone with a personal vendetta against you." I considered how much to reveal. Elena had been supportive and professional throughout our relationship, and she deserved to understand why her company might be targeted with false information about one of their consultants. "I have reason to believe that family members have been conducting unauthorized reference checks and providing false information about my professional conduct," I said carefully. It's a situation I'm working to address, but in the meantime, I wanted to make sure you were aware that any negative information you might receive about me from anonymous sources is likely to be fabricated. Elena's response was immediate and emphatic. That's horrible, Zoe. I can't imagine family members deliberately sabotaging someone's career, but it would explain the strange nature of yesterday's call. Unfortunately, it's not the first time this has happened, but I'm in a much stronger position to address it now than I was when it first started. Is there anything TechFlow can do to help? We obviously value our consulting relationship with you, and we don't want to see your professional reputation damaged by false information. Just continue to handle any unauthorized reference requests the way you handled yesterday's call. Don't provide information to unverified sources, and let me know if anyone tries to pressure you or becomes aggressive when you refuse to cooperate. Absolutely. And Zoe, for what it's worth, anyone who's worked with you directly knows that the allegations I heard yesterday are completely inconsistent with your actual professional conduct. Your work for TechFlow has been exemplary, and your insights have been invaluable to our fraud detection development. The conversation ended on a positive note, but it confirmed my growing suspicion that my parents' sabotage campaign was escalating. They weren't just trying to prevent me from getting jobs anymore. They were actively trying to destroy the consulting business I'd built and the professional relationships I'd developed. But what they didn't understand was that my professional circumstances had evolved far beyond anything they could damage with anonymous phone calls and whisper campaigns. I wasn't a desperate job seeker anymore. I was a venture capitalist with significant influence in Austin's technology community, and I had resources and relationships they couldn't touch. It was time for them to learn that lesson in ways they would never forget. The turning point came on a Thursday morning in May, when my assistant knocked on my office door with an expression that suggested both urgency and confusion. Catherine had been working with Morris Caldwell Ventures for 3 months, managing my calendar and handling administrative tasks with the kind of efficiency that allowed me to focus on investment decisions and portfolio management. Zoe, there's a woman here who says she's your mother. Catherine said carefully. She doesn't have an appointment, but she's quite insistent about speaking with you immediately. She seems upset about something. My mother, in my office. Without warning or explanation. The possibilities for why she might be here ranged from family emergency to the kind of confrontation I'd been anticipating but hoping to avoid. Did she say what this was regarding? I asked, closing the investment proposal I'd been reviewing. She mentioned something about protecting you from making a serious mistake, and she asked several questions about the nature of your business here. I told her I couldn't discuss your work without your permission, but she seemed to think I was being deliberately obstructive. I could picture the scene perfectly. My mother convinced that I was involved in some kind of risky venture that threatened my financial security, arriving unannounced to stage an intervention based on assumptions that were completely disconnected from reality. Please ask her to wait in the conference room, I said. And Catherine, whatever you overhear during this conversation, I'd appreciate your discretion. Of course, she replied, though her expression suggested she was beginning to understand that this might not be a typical family visit. I took a few minutes to prepare mentally for whatever confrontation was about to unfold. My office space had evolved significantly since the early days of Morris Caldwell Ventures. The walls now displayed framed articles from Austin Business Journal featuring my investments, photos from startup events where I'd been keynote speaker, and a certificate recognizing Morris Caldwell Ventures as one of Austin's most promising new venture capital firms. The conference room where my mother was waiting overlooked downtown Austin, with floor-to-ceiling windows that provided a clear view of the state capitol and the bustling business district that had become the heart of Texas's technology boom. It was designed to impress potential portfolio companies and communicate the success and stability of our fund. Patricia Caldwell sat at the mahogany conference table wearing the kind of carefully coordinated outfit that suggested she'd dressed specifically for what she anticipated would be a serious conversation. Her posture was tense, and her expression combined maternal concern with the kind of determination that had always characterized her approach to family problem solving. "Mom," I said, taking a seat across from her. "This is unexpected. Is everything okay?" "Zoe, I need to talk to you about what you're doing here," she began without preamble. "Your father and I have been hearing things about your business activities, and we're concerned that you're getting involved in situations that could be financially and professionally dangerous." The irony was so profound that I almost laughed. My parents, who had systematically sabotaged my career prospects and hidden a multimillion-dollar inheritance to keep me financially dependent, were concerned about my involvement in professionally dangerous situations. What kinds of things have you been hearing? I asked, genuinely curious about how information about Morris Caldwell Ventures had reached their social circle. Linda Morrison's husband works in commercial real estate downtown, and he mentioned seeing your name associated with some kind of investment firm, my mother explained. When we looked into it, we discovered that you're apparently managing other people's money and making investment decisions that could affect their financial security. Linda Morrison, I remembered her from various family gatherings and neighborhood events. Her husband managed commercial properties for one of Austin's larger real estate firms, which explained how he might have encountered Morris Caldwell Ventures in connection with our office lease or potential portfolio company real estate needs. Mom, I appreciate your concern, but I think there might be some misunderstanding about what I'm doing and how qualified I am to do it. Zoe, managing investments requires extensive training and certification that you don't have, she continued. Her voice taking on the patient tone she'd always used when explaining why my ambitions exceeded my capabilities. You could be held legally responsible if you make poor decisions with other people's money, and you could face serious financial consequences if your investments don't perform as expected. The conversation was surreal. My mother was sitting in the conference room of a multimillion-dollar venture capital fund, surrounded by evidence of my professional success, lecturing me about my lack of qualifications to manage investments that had already generated returns exceeding industry benchmarks. What specific concerns do you have about my current business activities? I asked, trying to understand exactly what information she'd received and how she'd interpreted it. We're concerned that you're taking on responsibilities that are beyond your experience level, and that you might be making promises to investors that you can't keep, she said. Starting an investment firm isn't like freelance consulting, Zoe. There are regulatory requirements, fiduciary responsibilities, and potential legal liabilities that could ruin your life if something goes wrong. Her concerns weren't entirely unreasonable if they'd been based on accurate information about my circumstances and qualifications. Starting a venture capital firm did require extensive expertise, regulatory compliance, and significant capital. The problem was that she had no understanding of how Morris Caldwell Ventures had been established, what resources were backing it, or what my track record had been since launching the fund. Mom, can I ask you something directly? I said, leaning forward slightly. When you and Dad made those reference calls to TechFlow and other companies I'd applied to, were you trying to protect me from career opportunities that you thought I couldn't handle, or were you trying to keep me financially dependent so you could continue controlling my decisions? The question landed like a physical blow. My mother's face went pale, and I could see her mental calculations as she tried to determine how much I knew and what the consequences might be of admitting to the sabotage campaign. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. We've never interfered with your job applications. Mom, I have recordings of the phone calls, I said quietly. I know you posed as former supervisors and told potential employers that I was emotionally unstable and dishonest. I know Dad made follow-up calls claiming to be concerned family friends. I know you've been conducting unauthorized reference checks on my consulting clients as recently as last month. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. My mother stared at me with an expression that combined shock, fear, and the dawning realization that her careful manipulation had been discovered and documented. We were trying to protect you, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. You weren't ready for the kind of high-pressure positions you were applying for.
We thought you needed more time to develop the emotional stability and professional maturity that those roles required. Protect me from what exactly? From earning a good salary? From building a career? From becoming financially independent? From failing publicly and destroying your confidence, she replied, tears beginning to form in her eyes. You've always been sensitive to criticism and prone to emotional reactions when things don't go your way. We were afraid that if you got a job you couldn't handle, you'd have a breakdown that would make it even harder for you to find employment later. The explanation revealed the depth of her misunderstanding about both my capabilities and my character. She genuinely believed that I was fragile, incompetent, and likely to fail if given significant responsibilities. In her mind, the sabotage had been an act of loving protection rather than deliberate destruction. But her good intentions didn't change the consequences of her actions, and they didn't excuse the systematic deception that had nearly destroyed my career prospects. Mom, do you have any idea what you actually accomplished with those phone calls?
I asked, struggling to keep my voice level. You didn't protect me from failure, you guaranteed it. You didn't preserve my confidence. You systematically destroyed it by making me believe that I was unemployable and that something was fundamentally wrong with my professional conduct. We never intended for you to find out, she said defensively. We thought you'd eventually find a position that was better suited to your capabilities, and you'd be happier and more successful in a role that didn't exceed your emotional bandwidth. The patronizing language was infuriating, but it also provided crucial insight into how my parents viewed my potential and their role in managing my life decisions. They saw themselves as benevolent guardians protecting a child who couldn't be trusted to make appropriate choices about her own future. What about Uncle Morris's inheritance? I asked, changing direction. Were you protecting me from that too? The question caught her off guard, and I could see her struggling to formulate a response that wouldn't incriminate her further. The inheritance is being held in trust until you demonstrate the maturity to handle significant financial resources responsibly, she said carefully. Morris wanted his legacy to be preserved and used wisely, not squandered on impulsive decisions by beneficiaries who weren't ready for that level of financial responsibility. And who decided I wasn't ready? Uncle Morris, or you and Dad? We've been monitoring your progress and waiting for signs that you'd develop the stability and judgment necessary to manage substantial assets, she replied, avoiding the direct question. The evasion confirmed what I'd already discovered through my conversations with Whitmore and Associates. My parents had been using their authority as executors to prevent distribution of the inheritance, and they'd been using my resulting financial dependence as evidence that I wasn't ready for financial independence. Mom, I need you to understand something, I said, standing up and walking to the window overlooking downtown Austin. Your assessment of my capabilities and readiness for responsibility is based on information that's nearly a year out of date. I turned back to face her, gesturing toward the office space around us. This is Morris Caldwell Ventures. I'm the founder and managing partner. We currently manage $8 million in venture capital, and we have investments in 12 companies across Austin's technology sector. My mother stared at me with an expression of complete bewilderment. That's impossible. You don't have access to that kind of money, and you don't have the credentials or experience to manage a venture capital fund. I have access to that money because it's Uncle Morris's legacy, which I've been using exactly as he intended to support entrepreneurs and create opportunities in the technology sector, I explained. I have the credentials because I've been building them through successful investments and strategic partnerships over the past 8 months. I walked to my desk and retrieved a folder containing our most recent quarterly report, fund performance metrics, and portfolio company summaries. These are the results of the incompetent, emotionally unstable daughter you've been trying to protect from her own poor judgment. My mother opened the folder and began reading, her expression shifting from skepticism to confusion to something approaching shock as she processed the information in front of her. This says you've generated returns of 34% over 8 months, she said, looking up at me with genuine amazement. That's better than most professional investment managers achieve. It's exactly what you'd expect from someone who actually possesses the analytical capabilities and professional judgment that you've been insisting I lack, I replied. She continued reading, absorbing details about portfolio companies, investment strategies, and strategic partnerships that demonstrated a level of business sophistication far beyond what she'd believed I was capable of achieving. How is this possible? She asked. Finally, when did you gain access to Morris's inheritance? How did you learn about venture capital? How did you build relationships with all these companies? I gained access to the inheritance by demonstrating to Uncle Morris's lawyers that I possessed exactly the kind of stability and judgment that you've been claiming I don't have, I explained. I learned about venture capital by studying successful firms and building relationships with other investors. I built relationships with companies by providing value through my consulting work and proving my expertise through results. The revelation was clearly overwhelming for her, but I wasn't finished. Mom, do you remember TechFlow Industries, the company where I interviewed for a data analytics position last year? She nodded hesitantly, probably remembering the reference calls she'd made to sabotage my candidacy. I'm currently on their board of directors as a result of Morris Caldwell Ventures' $12 million investment in their Series B funding round. I continued, the position you prevented me from getting as an employee, I now hold as a strategic partner and equity stakeholder. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same company where her sabotage had cost me a job was now paying me consulting fees and seeking my input on strategic decisions because my expertise and investment capital had made me valuable to their success. The woman you convinced not to hire me because I was emotionally unstable now reports to a board that I sit on, and she does so with full knowledge that your reference calls were fabricated and designed to damage my reputation. My mother's face had gone completely white. She was beginning to understand not just that her sabotage had failed, but that it had backfired in ways that placed her in a potentially humiliating and legally vulnerable position. "Zoe, I don't understand how any of this happened," she said weakly. "9 months ago, you were living in our house, unemployed, and struggling to find work. How did you build all of this so quickly?" "I built it because I had to," I replied simply. "When you destroyed my prospects for traditional employment, I was forced to create my own opportunities. When you kept me financially dependent by hiding my inheritance, I learned to generate income through consulting and investment activities. Every obstacle you created forced me to develop capabilities that ultimately made me more successful than I would have been if you'd simply allowed me to pursue the career path I'd originally planned." The conversation continued for another hour, during which I walked my mother through the details of Morris Caldwell Ventures' investment strategy, portfolio performance, and strategic partnerships. By the time we finished, she had a comprehensive understanding of what I'd accomplished and how significantly she'd underestimated my capabilities. But the most important moment came when Catherine knocked on the conference room door to inform me that Harrison Reed from TechFlow was on the phone with an urgent matter that required my immediate attention. "Please tell Mr. Reed I'll be with him in just a moment," I said, then turned back to my mother. "Mom, Harrison Reed is the CEO of TechFlow Industries. He's calling because as a board member and strategic investor, my input is required for a decision they're making about a potential acquisition opportunity." I picked up the conference room phone and activated the speaker function so my mother could hear both sides of the conversation. "Harrison, this is Zoe. I have you on speakerphone. What's the situation?" "Zoe, we've got an opportunity to acquire a smaller fraud detection firm based in Dallas, but we need to move quickly because they have multiple offers." Harrison's voice came through clearly. "The acquisition would accelerate our expansion into the SMB market and give us access to their proprietary machine learning algorithms." "What's the acquisition price and what kind of due diligence timeline are we looking at?" "They're asking for $8 million, and they want a decision by Monday. I know it's short notice, but their technology could be transformative for our small business fraud prevention capabilities." "Have you had Elena's team evaluate their algorithms? What's her assessment of the technical integration challenges?" "Elena thinks the integration would be straightforward, and she's excited about the potential to combine their SMB-focused approach with our enterprise-level infrastructure. The cultural fit also seems good based on our preliminary discussions. Send me their technical specifications and financial statements by end of day and let's schedule a board call for Saturday morning to discuss the strategic implications." "This sounds promising, but I want to see their IP portfolio and customer retention metrics before we commit to the timeline they're proposing." "Perfect. Thanks for the quick turnaround, Zoe. Your perspective on fraud detection technology will be crucial for evaluating this opportunity." "Happy to help. Talk to you Saturday." I hung up the phone and turned back to my mother, who had been listening to the conversation with an expression of complete astonishment. "That man calls you when his company is making $8 million acquisition decisions?" she asked incredulously. "He calls me because Morris Caldwell Ventures is TechFlow's largest investor, and because my technical expertise in fraud detection makes my input valuable for evaluating opportunities in that space," I explained. "This is what competent, emotionally stable people do, Mom. They build relationships based on mutual respect and demonstrated value, and they contribute to decisions that create opportunities for other people." The contrast between her perception of my capabilities and the reality of my current responsibilities was finally becoming clear to her. The daughter she'd believed was too fragile and incompetent for a staff analyst position was now helping guide strategic decisions for companies that processed billions of dollars in transactions. "I don't understand how we got this so wrong," she said quietly, staring at the quarterly report still spread across the conference table. "You got it wrong because you never bothered to assess my actual capabilities," I replied. "You made assumptions based on outdated information and family dynamics that had nothing to do with my professional competence, and then you used those assumptions to justify actions that nearly destroyed my career." "What happens now?" she asked, and for the first time in the conversation, her voice carried genuine fear rather than protective concern.
It was a good question. My parents had committed fraud by making false statements to potential employers, violated fiduciary responsibilities by misrepresenting the terms of Uncle Morris's inheritance, and potentially exposed themselves to civil litigation by interfering with my business relationships. The evidence I'd collected could support both criminal charges and civil lawsuits that would result in serious legal and financial consequences for them. But pursuing those remedies would require time and emotional energy that I'd rather invest in building Morris Caldwell Ventures and supporting the entrepreneurs in our portfolio. More importantly, destroying my parents wouldn't create additional value for anyone, and it wouldn't undo the damage their actions had already caused. What happens now depends entirely on whether you and Dad are capable of understanding the seriousness of what you've done and making changes that prevent similar interference in the future, I said carefully. We never intended to hurt you, she repeated, though her tone suggested she was beginning to understand that intentions weren't sufficient to excuse the consequences of their actions. But you did hurt me, Mom. You nearly destroyed my career prospects, you kept me financially dependent through deception, and you continued sabotaging my professional relationships even after I'd built a successful consulting practice. The only reason I survived your interference is because I was forced to build something that was too big and too visible for you to destroy with anonymous phone calls. My mother nodded slowly, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. What can we do to make this right? The question suggested she was finally beginning to understand both the magnitude of her mistakes and the precarious position those mistakes had placed her family in. But making things right would require more than apologies and good intentions. You can start by never interfering with my professional relationships again, I said firmly. No more reference calls, no more anonymous complaints, no more attempts to protect me from opportunities that you think exceed my capabilities. Of course, she agreed immediately. You can also facilitate the immediate distribution of Brooke's portion of Uncle Morris's inheritance, since she's been unaware of the delays and deserves access to resources that belong to her. We can arrange that, she said, though her expression suggested she was concerned about how Brooke might react to learning that her inheritance had been withheld. And you can acknowledge, publicly if necessary, that the reference information you provided to companies I'd applied to was inaccurate and motivated by family concerns rather than professional experience. This request caused her to pause. Publicly admitting to the sabotage would be humiliating and could expose her to legal consequences, but it might also be necessary to fully repair the damage she'd caused to my professional reputation. If that's what it takes to make things right, then yes, she said finally. But as satisfying as those concessions were, they didn't address the fundamental issue that had created this situation in the first place. Mom, the most important thing you need to understand is that your assessment of my capabilities was wrong, and your approach to protecting me from perceived failures actually guaranteed that I would struggle more than necessary, I said, walking back to the window overlooking downtown Austin. I can see that now, she replied. What you've accomplished here is extraordinary, and it's clear that we underestimated both your potential and your resilience. The question is whether you can adjust your expectations and treatment going forward, or whether you'll continue viewing me as someone who needs protection from her own poor judgment. It was the crux of our relationship moving forward. My professional success had proven that their concerns about my capabilities were unfounded, but success alone wouldn't necessarily change deeply held beliefs about my character and judgment. Zoe, after seeing what you've built here and understanding what you've accomplished despite our interference, I think it's safe to say that our concerns were misguided, my mother said with something approaching humility. We clearly don't understand your capabilities or your potential as well as we thought we did. The admission was more than I'd expected, and it suggested that the shock of discovering my actual circumstances might be sufficient to create lasting changes in our family dynamics. But I was about to discover that changing my mother's perception of my capabilities was the easy part. The real challenge would come when my father learned what had been happening, and when Brooke discovered that her inheritance had been withheld while her sister was secretly building a business empire with resources she didn't know existed. The family meeting that would change everything happened 3 weeks later on a Saturday afternoon in June. My mother had requested what she called a complete family discussion about recent developments, though she'd been deliberately vague about what those developments entailed when speaking with my father and Brooke. I arrived at the Westlake Hills house carrying a leather portfolio that contained documentation I hoped wouldn't be necessary, but suspected might be required before the afternoon was over. The familiar surroundings felt strange now, like visiting a childhood home that belonged to someone else's memories.
Brooke was already there, sitting at the kitchen island with her laptop open, editing content from her latest brand partnership with a wellness company. She looked up when I entered, offering the kind of warm smile that suggested she had no idea this gathering was anything more than a routine family check-in. "Hey Zoe," she said, closing her laptop. "Mom said she wanted to talk to all of us about some family business stuff. Do you know what that's about?" "I think it's related to some financial matters that need to be discussed," I replied carefully, not wanting to reveal the scope of what was about to unfold. My father emerged from his home office carrying a stack of papers that I recognized as financial statements and legal documents. His expression was tense in a way that suggested my mother had already briefed him on at least some of what she'd discovered during her visit to my office. "Zoe," he said, his tone formal and cautious. "Your mother mentioned that there have been some developments regarding your business activities that we need to address as a family." The phrase business activities carried implications that suggested he still didn't fully understand the nature or scope of what I'd built with Morris Caldwell Ventures. He was approaching this conversation with the mindset of parents who needed to intervene in their daughters' questionable financial decisions, not parents who were about to learn they'd been systematically sabotaging someone far more capable than they'd realized. "Why don't we sit down in the living room?" my mother suggested, gesturing toward the seating area where family discussions had taken place for as long as I could remember. This conversation might take a while. We arranged ourselves in the familiar configuration, my parents on the large sectional sofa, Brooke in the oversized armchair she'd claimed as her own during high school, and me in the chair closest to the windows overlooking their carefully maintained backyard. The setup felt like a tribunal, with me facing the rest of the family across the coffee table. "Before we begin," my mother said, looking directly at my father, "I need you both to understand that some of the assumptions we've been making about Zoe's professional situation have been incorrect." Brooke glanced between our parents with confusion. "What kind of assumptions? Is everything okay with your consulting work, Zoe?" "That's what we're here to discuss," my father interjected, opening the folder he'd brought from his office. "It appears that Zoe has been involved in investment activities that extend far beyond the consulting practice we thought she was building." The conversation was already heading in a direction that would make the revelations more dramatic than necessary, but I decided to let my parents control the pace rather than jumping directly to the conclusions they were still processing. "Glenn," my mother said, her voice carrying a warning that suggested she wanted him to be careful about his tone and assumptions. "I think it would be better if Zoe explained her current situation herself rather than us making statements based on incomplete information." "What incomplete information?" Brooke asked, now clearly sensing undercurrents she didn't understand. "What's going on that I don't know about?" I looked around the room at my family members, each of whom had different pieces of a puzzle they hadn't yet assembled into a complete picture. Brooke knew nothing about the inheritance, the sabotage, or my transformation into a venture capitalist. My father knew about the inheritance delays, but apparently hadn't been fully briefed on my business success. My mother knew about my professional achievements, but was still processing the implications for the family's financial and legal situation. "There are several things we need to discuss," I said, opening my portfolio and removing a bound document. "But I think it makes sense to start with Uncle Morris's estate and the inheritance that was supposed to be distributed to Brooke and me years ago." Brooke's head snapped toward our parents with an expression of complete surprise. "What inheritance?" "Uncle Morris left us money." "Uncle Morris left both of you substantial assets," my father said reluctantly. "But the distribution has been delayed, while we evaluated whether you were ready to handle significant financial responsibilities." "How substantial?" Brooke asked, her voice rising slightly. "And who decided we weren't ready?" "Morris died 3 years ago. I was 22 then, but I'm 25 now. When exactly was I going to be informed about resources that belong to me?" The questions were direct and justified, and I could see my father struggling to formulate responses that wouldn't reveal the extent of the deception and manipulation that had characterized their handling of the estate. "The inheritance includes business assets, patent royalties, and investment accounts that total approximately $4 million for each of you," I said, providing the information my parents seemed reluctant to share. "It was supposed to be distributed when you turned 25, which means your portion should have been available 6 months ago." Brooke stared at our parents with an expression that combined shock, anger, and hurt. $4 million. You've been sitting on $4 million that belongs to me, and you never mentioned it. We were waiting for signs that you'd develop the maturity and financial responsibility necessary to manage substantial assets without making decisions you'd regret later," my mother explained, using the same language she'd offered during our office confrontation. "What signs?" Brooke demanded. I've built a successful business. I pay my own expenses. I make smart financial decisions with my earnings. What exactly was I supposed to demonstrate that I haven't already proven? It was a fair question, and one that highlighted the arbitrary nature of my parents' decision-making regarding the inheritance. Brooke had indeed demonstrated financial responsibility and business acumen through her influencer career, yet she'd been kept in the dark about resources that legally belonged to her.
There's more to the story, I continued, wanting to provide full context before the conversation devolved into accusations and defensive justifications. The inheritance delays are connected to a broader pattern of interference in our professional and financial development. I removed a folder from my portfolio and placed it on the coffee table. For the past 18 months, Mom and Dad have been conducting unauthorized reference checks and providing false information to companies that have considered hiring me or working with me professionally. False information about what? Brooke asked, though her tone suggested she was beginning to understand that this family meeting was about more than delayed inheritances. They've been telling potential employers and clients that I'm emotionally unstable, prone to breakdowns under pressure, and dishonest about my qualifications and achievements, I explained, watching my father's face for reactions. The goal was to prevent me from securing employment or building a successful consulting practice. Brooke turned to stare at our parents with an expression of complete disbelief. You've been sabotaging Zoe's career. Why would you do something like that? We were concerned that she was pursuing opportunities that exceeded her capabilities, my father said defensively. We thought she needed more time to develop the emotional stability and professional maturity that high-level positions require. So you decided to make those decisions for her by lying to potential employers? Brooke's voice was getting louder, and I could see her processing the implications of what she was hearing. You cost her jobs by spreading false information about her character and qualifications. We thought we were protecting her from situations where she might fail publicly and damage her long-term career prospects, my mother added, though her tone lacked the conviction it had carried during our office conversation. Brooke looked at me with something approaching horror. Zoe, how long has this been going on? How many opportunities did they destroy? The sabotage cost me at least 6 job opportunities over the past year, including a position at TechFlow Industries that would have been perfect for my background and career goals, I replied. But the interference didn't stop with job applications. They've also been making unauthorized reference calls to companies I've worked with as a consultant, trying to damage my professional reputation and client relationships. The revelation was clearly overwhelming for Brooke, who was struggling to reconcile the parents she thought she knew with people capable of such systematic deception and manipulation. This is insane, she said finally. You've been deliberately sabotaging your own daughter's career while keeping both of us in the dark about resources that belong to us. What else have you been hiding? It was the perfect opening for the revelation that would change the entire dynamic of our family relationship. Actually, there is something else, I said, removing the final document from my portfolio. The sabotage campaign failed in ways that Mom and Dad didn't anticipate, and the inheritance situation has been resolved in ways they're still processing. I placed Morris Caldwell Ventures' latest quarterly report on the coffee table, along with news articles about our recent investments and a formal letter from Whitmore and Associates confirming my role as managing partner of the fund. When my job search was destroyed by their reference calls, I was forced to build my own opportunities through consulting and entrepreneurship, I continued. When I discovered that my inheritance was being withheld, I worked with Uncle Morris's lawyers to establish my legal rights and gain access to the resources he'd intended for me to have. Brooke picked up the quarterly report and began reading, her expression shifting from confusion to amazement as she absorbed the information in front of her. Morris Caldwell Ventures, she read aloud. Managing partner Zoe Caldwell. Assets under management $8 million. Portfolio companies 12 active investments. She looked up at me with wide eyes. Zoe, you're running a venture capital fund? I am. I used my portion of Uncle Morris's inheritance to establish a fund that supports technology entrepreneurs, particularly women and underrepresented minorities who face systemic barriers in accessing capital and mentorship. Your portion of the inheritance, my father interjected. You don't have independent access to Morris's assets. The distribution requires approval from the estate executors. Actually, I do have independent access, I replied, handing him the letter from Whitmore and Associates. When I documented the unauthorized delays in distribution and provided evidence of the estate executors using their authority to harm the beneficiary's financial interests, Morris's lawyers removed you as executor and distributed my portion according to his original wishes. My father read the letter with an expression of growing dismay. The legal language was clear and unambiguous. His authority over the estate had been revoked due to breach of fiduciary duty, and both Brooke and I now had full access to our inheritances without his involvement or approval. This says the lawyers found evidence of deliberate interference with the beneficiary's financial and professional development, he said, his voice tight with tension. What evidence did you provide them? I removed a flash drive from my portfolio and placed it on the coffee table. Recordings of the reference calls you made to TechFlow and other companies, documentation of the lies you told about my professional conduct, email records showing your instructions to delay inheritance distribution, and testimonials from clients whose businesses you tried to interfere with through unauthorized reference checks. The silence that followed was profound. My parents were finally understanding not just that their sabotage had been discovered, but that it had been documented in ways that could support both civil and criminal legal action. You recorded our phone calls, my mother asked weakly. I recorded calls to a fictional company I created specifically to document your sabotage activities, I corrected. The recordings prove that you were systematically providing false information to employers with the intent of damaging my career prospects. Brooke had been listening to this exchange with an expression of growing anger and disbelief. Let me understand this correctly, she said, her voice dangerously quiet. You've been sabotaging Zoe's career for over a year while hiding millions of dollars that belong to both of us. And your justification is that we weren't mature enough to handle our own money or make our own career decisions. We thought we were acting in your best interests, my father said, though the defense sounded weak even to him. Our best interests? Brooke's voice was rising again. Zoe's best interests were served by losing jobs she was qualified for because you lied about her character. My best interests were served by being kept ignorant about resources that could have changed my life trajectory. She stood up and began pacing around the living room, her agitation clearly growing as she processed the full scope of what had been done to us. Do you realize what $4 million would have meant to me 6 months ago? She continued. Do you understand how different my business decisions would have been if I'd known I had that kind of financial security? I've been stressing about income and sponsorship deals and building my brand, when I could have been focusing on content and creativity without worrying about paying rent. It was a valid point that highlighted one of the most insidious aspects of my parents' deception. By keeping us ignorant about our financial resources, they'd forced us to make decisions based on artificial scarcity rather than our actual circumstances. And Zoe, Brooke said, turning to me with something approaching awe. You built a venture capital fund while dealing with active sabotage from your own family. How did you even survive that, let alone succeed? I survived it because I had to, I replied simply. When traditional employment became impossible due to their interference, I was forced to create my own opportunities. When I discovered the inheritance manipulation, I had to develop relationships with lawyers and financial advisors to protect my interests. Every obstacle they created forced me to become more independent and resourceful. And now, Brooke asked, what's your situation now? I glanced around the room at my family members, each of whom was waiting for an answer that would help them understand where we stood in relation to each other going forward. Now I run a successful venture capital fund that has generated 34% returns over 8 months, I said. I sit on the boards of multiple technology companies, including TechFlow Industries, where I help guide strategic decisions and oversee investments worth millions of dollars. I have consulting relationships with companies that rely on my expertise in fraud detection and financial analytics. And I have legal documentation of every attempt Mom and Dad made to interfere with my professional development. The comprehensive summary seemed to stun everyone into silence. My parents were finally grasping the full extent of what I'd accomplished despite their sabotage, and Brooke was beginning to understand that her sister had transformed from struggling consultant to successful venture capitalist, while she'd been completely unaware of the family drama unfolding around her. There's one more thing you should know, I continued, deciding to complete the picture. Last month, Harrison Reed, the CEO of TechFlow Industries, personally offered me the senior data analyst position that I'd originally applied for. I declined the offer because my current role as a board member and strategic investor provides more influence and higher compensation than employment would. My father's face had gone completely white. TechFlow offered you a job, after everything that happened. They offered me a job because their leadership team recognized that the reference calls they'd received were fabricated and designed to damage my reputation, I explained.
When Harrison discovered that qualified candidates had been rejected based on false information, he implemented new hiring practices and reached out to discuss how TechFlow could benefit from my expertise. So the position you prevented me from getting as an employee, I now hold as a strategic partner with equity ownership and board authority, I concluded. The company where your sabotage cost me a job now pays me consulting fees and seeks my input on multi-million-dollar decisions. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. My parents' attempts to protect me from opportunities they thought I couldn't handle had ultimately forced me to build something far more significant than any job they'd cost me. What happens now? My father asked, echoing the same question my mother had posed during our office confrontation. It was the crucial question that would determine whether our family could move forward with honest relationships or whether the damage was too extensive to repair. That depends on whether you're capable of accepting that your assessment of my capabilities was wrong and your approach to protecting me was harmful, I said. It also depends on whether you can commit to never interfering with my professional relationships again. Of course, my mother said immediately. We understand now that our concerns were misguided and our methods were inappropriate. And it depends on whether you can facilitate Brooke's immediate access to her inheritance without any additional delays or conditions. I continued. Absolutely, my father agreed. I'll contact Whitmore and Associates on Monday morning to expedite the distribution process. Brooke had been listening to this exchange with an expression that suggested she was still processing everything she'd learned. What about the companies you lied to about Zoe? She asked our parents. Are you going to correct the false information you provided? It was a question I'd been wondering about as well. Simply stopping the sabotage wouldn't repair the damage that had already been done to my professional reputation, and companies that had received false information about my character deserved to know the truth. If that's what's required to make things right, then yes, my mother said. Though her tone suggested she understood the personal consequences of publicly admitting to the sabotage campaign. I think it would be more effective for me to address any reputation issues directly through my current professional relationships, I replied. The success of Morris Caldwell Ventures and my consulting work speaks for itself, and trying to explain the family dynamics to potential employers or clients would probably create more confusion than clarity. The conversation continued for another hour, during which we established ground rules for future family interactions and discussed practical steps for moving forward. By the time we finished, everyone had a clear understanding of the new dynamics and expectations. But the most significant moment came as I was preparing to leave, when Brooke approached me in the driveway. Zoe, I need to tell you something, she said, her voice serious and thoughtful. What you've accomplished despite everything they did to undermine you is incredible. But more than that, the way you've handled this situation shows a level of grace and maturity that I'm not sure I would have been capable of. What do you mean? I asked. You could have destroyed them, she explained. You have recordings, documentation, legal grounds for both civil and criminal action. You could have exposed them publicly, sued them for damages, and made sure everyone in Austin knew what they'd done to you. But instead you used your success to teach them a lesson without destroying them in the process. She was right. The evidence I'd collected could have supported lawsuits that would have cost my parents their house, their businesses, and their reputation in the community. The recordings of their sabotage calls could have been devastating if released publicly. Destroying them wouldn't have created value for anyone, I replied. And it wouldn't have undone the damage they'd already caused. Building something meaningful despite their interference was more satisfying than revenge would have been. That's exactly what I mean, Brooke said with a smile. You turned their attempts to control you into opportunities to prove they were wrong about your capabilities. That takes a level of strength and vision that most people don't possess. As I drove back to my apartment that evening, I reflected on how completely my circumstances had changed since the day I'd walked out of my childhood bedroom with nothing but a backpack and wounded pride. The financial security I'd gained through Morris Caldwell Ventures was significant, but the personal growth that had resulted from being forced to build my own opportunities was even more valuable. My parents had tried to protect me from challenges they thought I couldn't handle, but those challenges had ultimately been exactly what I needed to discover my actual potential. Their sabotage had forced me to develop resilience, resourcefulness, and independence that I might never have cultivated if they'd simply allowed me to pursue the comfortable career path I'd originally planned. The phone call from Harrison Reed came the next morning, just as I was settling into my office to review proposals from potential portfolio companies. Zoe, I hope you don't mind me calling on a Sunday, he said. though his tone suggested the call was both urgent and positive. I wanted to let you know that the TechFlow board has unanimously approved a recommendation that will significantly expand your role with our company. What kind of recommendation? I asked, though I could hear excitement building in his voice. We'd like to offer you the position of chairman of the board, Harrison said. The role would involve providing strategic oversight for all major business decisions, serving as a liaison between the board and executive team, and helping guide TechFlow's growth as we scale toward acquisition or IPO. Chairman of the board. The title carried implications that extended far beyond the board member role I'd held since Morris Caldwell Ventures' investment in TechFlow. As chairman, I would be the senior-most member of TechFlow's leadership structure, with authority over strategic direction and executive oversight. Harrison, I'm honored by the offer, I replied. Can you tell me what prompted the board to create this position? Honestly, it's been a combination of factors, he said. Your technical expertise has been invaluable for our product development decisions, your strategic insights have helped us avoid several costly mistakes, and your network in the financial services industry has opened doors that would have taken us years to access independently. And the board feels that expanding my role would benefit TechFlow's growth trajectory. The board feels that having you in a more senior leadership position would signal to potential acquirers and investors that TechFlow has the kind of strategic guidance and industry expertise that makes companies successful in the long term, Harrison explained. Your reputation in Austin's venture capital community carries a lot of weight, and your endorsement of our strategy and execution would be extremely valuable. The offer was both professionally exciting and personally satisfying. 18 months earlier, TechFlow had rejected my application for a mid-level analyst position based on lies my parents had told their HR department. Now they were offering me the most senior leadership role in the company, with compensation and equity that reflected the true value of my expertise and strategic contributions. I'd be very interested in discussing the opportunity, I said. When would you like to schedule a formal conversation about the role and compensation structure? Would Tuesday morning work for you? I'd like to have Elena and Marcus present as well, since the chairman role would involve close collaboration with both the technical and financial leadership teams. Tuesday morning is perfect. I'll see you then. As I hung up the phone, I couldn't help but smile at the irony of the situation. The same company where my parents' sabotage had cost me a job was now offering me the highest position in their organizational structure. Diana Worthington, the HR director who had delivered the devastating rejection based on fabricated concerns about my emotional stability, would now be presenting human resources updates to a board chaired by the person she'd helped exclude from the company. But the real satisfaction wasn't about vindication or revenge. It was about the knowledge that merit and capability ultimately matter more than manipulation and sabotage. It was about proving that people who try to tear others down often end up creating opportunities for those they underestimated to rise even higher. The call from my mother came that afternoon, just as I was finishing my review of the chairman role materials Harrison had sent over. Zoe, she said, her voice carrying a mixture of pride and amazement. Brooke told me about the position TechFlow offered you. Chairman of the board. That's extraordinary. It's a good opportunity, I replied neutrally, not sure whether she was calling to congratulate me or to express new concerns about my taking on responsibilities that exceeded my capabilities. I wanted to tell you how proud your father and I are of what you've accomplished, she continued, her tone suggesting genuine emotion rather than obligatory praise. We clearly underestimated both your potential and your resilience, and we're grateful that our mistakes didn't prevent you from building something so meaningful. The admission was more direct than I'd expected, and it suggested that my parents were finally beginning to understand not just that they'd been wrong about my capabilities, but that their attempts to limit my opportunities had been counterproductive in every possible way. Thank you for saying that, I replied. I hope this experience has taught all of us something about the importance of supporting family members' growth rather than trying to control their decisions. It has, she said, without hesitation. And Zoe, I want you to know that if anyone ever questions your qualifications or character in the future, they'll be hearing from me about why those questions are both inappropriate and inaccurate. The promise of support was touching, though I hoped I'd never need it. The success of Morris Caldwell Ventures and my growing reputation in Austin's business community had made it increasingly unlikely that anyone would question my professional competence based on anonymous phone calls or unsubstantiated concerns. But perhaps most importantly, I'd learned that my own assessment of my capabilities mattered more than anyone else's opinions. My parents had tried to convince me that I was fragile and incompetent, but their sabotage had ultimately forced me to discover strengths I hadn't known I possessed. 6 months later, I was sitting in TechFlow's boardroom as chairman, reviewing acquisition proposals that would expand our fraud detection capabilities into international markets. The company had grown from 87 employees to over 200. Our technology was protecting billions of dollars in transactions across multiple continents, and we were being courted by several major financial institutions interested in acquisition opportunities. Diana Worthington knocked on the door to inform me that Harrison was ready for our quarterly strategy meeting. She greeted me with the professional respect appropriate for the chairman of the board, showing no signs of awkwardness about our complicated history. As I gathered my materials for the meeting, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since the morning I'd received that devastating rejection call 18 months earlier. The sabotage that was supposed to protect me from failure had instead created opportunities for success beyond anything I'd originally imagined. My parents had learned the hard way that trying to control other people's opportunities often backfires in spectacular fashion. But more importantly, I'd learned that the most meaningful achievements come from building something valuable despite obstacles rather than waiting for perfect conditions or universal approval. The girl who'd walked out of her childhood home with nothing but wounded pride had become a woman who could create opportunities not just for herself, but for dozens of entrepreneurs who needed capital, mentorship, and someone willing to bet on their potential. And that transformation had been worth every challenge along the way. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.